Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today, I would like to address you in regards to the present situation. I have a question to pose. Who in this entire country of the United States of America could possibly help us get out of this mess that we're in? And I would like to present myself as putting forth a living answer to that question with a set of proposals that I have in mind that will help us to be able to look forward in a way that can light the way to a better future and help us to somehow achieve a happier tomorrow. And I know it seems kind of silly to try to think of something that could possibly be like a grand strategy to try to help us figure out, okay, this is where we are, this is the mess that we've gotten ourselves into. Sure, it's not ideal, and we had hopes that we were setting ourselves up for success. But a lot of things didn't pan out the way that many of us hoped it would. And we rested our hopes on an idea that when we look back on it in hindsight, really didn't have a really clear and coherent objective. And I think that's a lot of the trouble that we have with politics, is that candidates will put themselves forth and use the same old, tired, hollow promises and, platform these platitudes and suggest that I alone can fix it. But when it comes time and people ask, well, how do you propose that we fix it? And most of them are just like, man, just get me in power. And when I get in there, I'm gonna do the thing. My, elitism or my, credentials in, a meritocracy, make me the most qualified person to meet the challenges of right now. Just trust me. I have the charisma. I have the connections. I have, the following. I have the loyalists, and all of that together is going to be enough that once I just get in that position of power, man, I'm going to make things different. And it doesn't always work out that way. And consistently, America has, muddled along, and we've managed to make progress here and there. But then we have this great challenge where we have these different ideals from different leaders, and they come in to be, a representative or in the House or a senator or a president and someone in their executive branch or members of the Supreme Court or the many other positions in the court. And each one of those individuals has their own ideals, their own personalities, their own characteristics, their own belief systems, their own, groups and cliques, and then the people that they're beholden to, those people who they made promises to, that if you just help me to, get into office, I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back, lots of back scratching going on, And before candidates even get into office, they are already, so vested. There's this concept that I think of when it's like no one person can do everything, but everybody can do something. And we each only have so much that we can do in a day. We all have, only so many spoons that we can hold. And when you give away those spoons to other people, you pledge to them, this spoon is for you, and you help me to get into this position, and I dedicate this spoon to helping you to achieve whatever. And so you take a piece of yourself and you fully commit it to someone else. And then suddenly you find yourself having to do that to a bunch of people. And by the time you get into office, you don't even have any spoons left to do the job you're hired to do. And so, of course, it's the constituents that end up suffering. They are convinced through, ad campaigns and rally events and, swag gear and, media conversations and podcast conversations and leaflets and pamphlets and people knocking on doors and phone calls and surveys and all of this just inundated with information, casting the person's name and the candidate's name and saying, I'm the best for the job, I'm going to do the thing, I have the prestige, I have the merit, I have the consistency, I have, the history, I have the finance and the money, I have the people, I know the things, and it all comes down to, at the end of the day, still, when you get into office, what are you able to do? And I don't see many politicians making it into the roles and the positions that they're, hired into, and for them to have very many spoons left to be able to do the things that they have to do to meet the obligations of that role and that duty. And then, it comes time to pay the piper for everybody that they made these commitments to along the way to get them to where they were going. And suddenly they are so absorbed in trying to fulfill those commitments, the IOUs, they got to pay them back now, that they don't have time to invest in doing anything of service. Now take that into the context of while people are in their campaign, they're like, I'm going to do the thing. Just get me into office. I'm going to do the thing. I have the ability. I'm going to make it work. But they had no plan. They had no blueprint. They had no proposals. What they were offering is this, an IOU to the people. And then it kind of seems like a Ponzi scheme, doesn't it? Because it's like they gotta, convince the people to give them the power, so then they have the capacity to pay back all the people that they had to take the IOU out on in order to get them into that position. And then when they get into that position, the big IOU that they owed to the people for getting in that role, they no longer have anything to be able to give back to them. And so what can they do but to continue to convince the people that everything's fine? Do a couple things here and there, just try and make it seem like things are functional or working. Complain about the system, is rigged or broken, or I inherited this mess from somebody else. And, and then again, being so distracted with having to do the doings for the IOUs, for the people that got you into that place, by spending all this money to convince the voters, you don't have the time, effort, or energy to invest in actually figuring out what you're going to do to help the people. So now you're in that role, you don't have the time to figure it out. And you don't have a plan that you created before, and you're busy paying back all these IOUs. And in the meantime, the people are waiting. When is it going to be their turn? And then, your term in office ends and you really didn't get too far. I think that's a really big problem that we have with politics. I really wish we could get money out of politics, because I really do believe that it's corrupted everything, because it's making us miss the entire point of the exercise, right? The whole purpose of this thing has been replaced by this concept that, you determine whether somebody's worthy of being elected based off of how much money they can make in campaign finance. And their fundraising capability somehow proves them capable of being able to do the job, when really it doesn't. And that's been proven time and time again, has it not? How many people have been elected into positions of office and have, made all of these promises, and it always fell flat when it came time to, where the rubber meets the road. And so it's not really a good indicator of how much money you're able to make that you can turn around and spend on what? Advertisements? And advertisements in their own way, it's a good thing and a bad thing. I think advertisements can be, something good in the sense of like a public service announcement sort of thing for people. But, what we get instead is more like, trying to depict this sense of how you should feel, how you should think, and what you should do, because this ad is telling you that, and to give you a false sense of security and a sense of warm fuzziness inside when you get one of the positive advertisements that says vote for me because I'm awesome XYZ 123, and lists out all these things that makes them so great. In the meantime, they're paying just as much money to spend on advertisements to make you hate or despise or feel repulsed by, their, opponent in the race. And that, emotional manipulation, again, at the end of the day, what does it do for you? Nothing. And it's not to say all politicians do that, but that's what the game has become, and it's kind of what people have expected, to the point where they want to go to campaign rallies like it's some kind of like rock star event or something like that. And to me, it's like, I'm too practical and frugal to even think that that's a good thing to do. I would rather invest money to set like a keystone saying this is kind of like a prototype of what I intend to initiate at a much larger scale once I get into office. It's kind of like what happens at the local level. And then you scale it up through organization. And then you do the public-private partnership. And then you take it worldwide, hopefully, if it's a really good idea. I always thought that politics really should be about that, should be about what sort of brilliant ideas, what sort of grand strategies do you have? What sort of project proposals do you have that are going to have a tangible impact on the people's lives in such a way where they can see it, they can feel it, it's a tangibility. It's not just a whimsical thought like, oh, that's a nice idea, and then it's a fleeting thing, a fleeting emotion, and then you're left with nothing at the end of that. There needs to be something of substance that says, I want to get you excited about this. I want you to see the potential that's here. Here's a thing so you can wrap your mind around it, and then imagine, open your mind to the possibilities and see what is just there on the other side of us putting a little bit more effort behind this. Like, this is just the beginning, guys. And to get people excited about that. And to build a consensus around that. Like, yes, that really truly is an ideal that is worth aspiring to. That's worth working towards together and advancing. A campaign should really be about that. And we have lost touch with that for so long. Since the election for POTUS 45, we have seen just a tremendous falling from grace. And politics has always had its nasty side to it. But where we really took a wrong turn was when we started to allow people of such subpar character and personality to even be considered to be in the role of president. We have seen a predator become president. We have seen that same predator become president who's also a parasite. So we have a parasitic predator for a president. And politics has just gone way south ever since. I've seen President Pandemonium bring out the worst in everybody. And I mean everybody. And I just don't understand, and I never will, what people find compelling about the idea of having a person lead the prestigious nation of the United States of America. To be somebody who is so self-centered, so repulsive in his demeanor and his behavior, so disrespectful. He lacks kindness and compassion and care and tact. He lacks self-control. And I have always said this because I believe it in my heart that all people have the potential within them for redemption. And everybody has a bit of goodness in them. And that's the spark that you gotta find, and you gotta fan that flame to help to bring out the best in them. So it's not that I think that President Pandemonium is a total loss. I'm sure if I witnessed him with his children or his grandchildren, that there would be care there. And it's not to say he's a completely bad, irredeemable person. Because again, I don't think that's the case for anybody. But the problem is that he does not want to self-develop. He doesn't want to become a better man. He does not desire to be a good man. He doesn't desire to do right by others. He has not spent his life developing a conscience. I can imagine that he's probably spent his life silencing his conscience because he's done unsavory things. And your ego, when it hears your conscience, it echoes it really loud. And it's very hard to not feel guilty for doing things that you know are wrong. You know in your heart what's right and what's wrong. And so you learn to tune out your conscience. And you let your ego run rampant without that check and balance. And suddenly you disregard any of the signs that are out there saying, like, man, you're not doing right by others. You're being selfish and self-centered, and you're out of control. And you're hurting others. And you're doing the wrong thing. Yeah, you can get away with it. And you have gotten away with it. But just because you can and you have gotten away with it does not mean that you should try to get away with it. If you're doing the wrong thing, man, you gotta have a sensibility within yourself. It is always the right time to do what is right. And the hardest choice that any of us make is to understand how to do the right thing at the right time in the right way for the right reasons. And to turn the leaf if you need to. Turn the page on your old story and start anew doing good. But President Pandemonium is very old. He's coming at the end of his life, and I don't really know if he's ever tried to reconcile the idea of the hereafter and what that might mean. But I do know from the experience of being a caregiver of people nearing death and all the way into their death, there's something that I learned from them about regret and the woulda, coulda, shoulda, but I didn't. So who cares? They care. It's not until the end of your life that you actually care, like, man, I should have done things different. I could have done things different. I would have done things different. But man, I was so caught up in my selfishness that I didn't bother to try, didn't bother to stop and to think that there were consequences to my actions. Consequences that in the immediate moment others had to pay for. But in the karmatic retribution of time, ultimately, it's all going to come back on the fold onto you. And I don't want anybody to come to the end of their life and live a moment in regret. They should be able to rest in peace. But people who do bad things, people who are predators, people who are manipulators and exploiters, people who act like parasites and feed off of the energy and the substance of others, those are the ones that at the end of their life are going to find it the hardest to reconcile when karma comes and shows them the reflection of all that they could have been, should have been, would have been, if only they cared to try to be their best version. And I personally don't hate anybody. Like, I feel righteous anger when people do bad things, you know, but it's pity and it's disappointment, just amplified with a sense of frustration and righteous anger and a desire to want to fix it, to help them, to help themselves. And knowing that I'm a nobody to them, and so they will never take me seriously enough to trust me to help to reflect back to them that which could be the spark of inspiration for themselves to improve and to take me as a cheerleader for them, to champion for their betterment. Because that's a relationship of trust that's really, really hard to gain individual person to person. And here I am thinking that I'm going to be able to do that on a level of a whole population of people. And I recognize it's hard. But man, I really want to try. Because to me, it's worth it. Because I see the potential in everybody to be good. And I want to bring out the best in others. And I want to help be a, shining beacon of light to role model good humanity so that I might inspire bad actors with nefarious intent to decide to do things differently. Just wake up one day and just decide to do things differently. That's the hope that I have for every bad actor with nefarious intent. It's the hope that I have for President Pandemonium. And that's the hope that I have for every other politician who is right now in their positions of power. And they have the responsibility and duty to be of service to the people. And they're failing the people. They're making poor choices. They're helping to rig systems to favor a few at the expense of the many. They're turning a blind eye to crime and corruption and the installation of a cartel within the federal government. And the checks and the balances that are supposed to be there, they're tying their own hands and not doing their job. And I can understand there's probably a sense of fear in that, of not wanting the angry mob to be, President Pandemonium to sick his angry mob onto these people. because things have gotten way out of hand and we have political violence all over the place. You have people threatening the lives of others just because they don't like their political views, or the fact that they're calling out the corruption that they see, or calling out bad politicians for their bullshit. All of a sudden, trying to do the right thing to uphold the Constitution makes them a target for political violence, for people who have been led to believe that violence is the answer to solving their problems when things don't work out their way in terms of politics and government. Every single person that was there on January 6th that was incited to go and storm the Capitol, wreak havoc, threaten our democracy, instill fear in the hearts and the minds of every American. All of those people on that day were bad actors with nefarious intent. They did the wrong thing, and they should have been held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. And I've said this before, and I honestly believe it in my heart, that had they gone through and been judged by a jury of their peers and found to be guilty of whatever bad, criminal thing that they did, and they accepted it and said it wasn't the right thing to do, that a pardon would have been appropriate to help us as a nation to move beyond that. And I've said it before, and I very much believe it. The conditions by which President Pandemonium, when he was POTUS 45 and incited in an attempted coup, an insurrection on our capital, should have been held accountable to the fullest extent of the law, tried by his peers, and then it would have been appropriate to give him a pardon, so long as we all got on the same page as that never should have happened. And that's not how we solve our problems in government. Democracy is about, we don't forcibly overthrow governments. We do it at the ballot box, guys. Have some self-control. And there's always another election, and you can try again, but only if you're worthy of it. And you certainly aren't worthy of being reelected if you spend all of your time inciting violence, And if you could come to terms with that, okay, that was a mistake, and I'm sorry, and I won't ever do that again. Redemption, a clear path to redemption should be made for such, and then a pardon would have been appropriate, because think of the beautiful story that would have made for our nation. Man, we were on the brink, and so many people were fed up, and things were just not working as we had wanted or hoped, or at least that group of people wanted or hoped. And they were, pent up frustration, and then they were led to act on that frustration in an inappropriate manner, and they made mistakes. And if they could have come to the light, seen that mistake for what it was, a heated moment of error, and committed themselves to a path of redemption, they could have earned the privilege of a pardon. So could have President Pandemonium. And our nation would have been able to look back on that and said, this was a moment where we almost lost everything, but look, we all came together. And even the people who made the mistake said, I'm sorry. And we worked together to move on from that, to be stronger, use it as an opportunity, a growing opportunity for growth, to form a more perfect union. But instead it became this political infighting. President Pandemonium staked his entire claim on future elections on, piss moan and complaining about having lost the other one and how it was stolen away from him. And all of these other people were emotionally invested in that sense that this election was stolen from him, so it was stolen from them, and they need their revenge. And President Pandemonium said, "I will be your retribution." And more political violence came up because people started to get to the brink where they feel like there's no way that the system is working for any of us. And there's no way that we can allow these sorts of things to go on. And so people left to their own devices in an atmosphere where violence has been perpetuated, and these people got away with doing terrible things. That atmosphere of violence grows, and it inspires more violence. And there was no calming voice to say, lots of people were like, this is not who we are. This is, not what we are as Americans. We need to not tolerate that. But that's not enough. We need to not seek the punitive direction, but rather seek the path of redemption and discipline, and to set a standard and to role model better versions, and to compel other people to bring out their best versions instead of constantly coming at it with their worst versions. But then we had, POTUS 46 did wrong by the American people by promising they were going to be a one-term president, and then tried going for, a second term in which there was nothing, they had nothing compelling enough to make the American people want another term of that. They're just saying you're gonna, keep the POTUS President Pandemonium from coming back in again was not compelling enough, especially because he spent all this time inciting all these people to build up, come on guys, we're gonna take it back. And we were really let down. We were saved in 2020, in the 2020 election, from things getting much worse, especially in terms of the pandemic and whatnot. But we were not set up for success. And that 4 years should have been, working on recovery from the pandemic, but also setting the stage for what is to come. And a plan that says, we're building for the next 3 years, developing for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years, for the next 30 years, for the next 100 years. Bring a vision of what is to come for America, and set the stage for that. Do your small part. I mean, one term is not enough, but you can do a tremendous amount in that time, especially when you have so many people that want to help you succeed. And I believe at the beginning, President Biden had that. So many people were just so relieved that Trump didn't win again. It was like we needed a break from all of that, because it was just out of hand. He was out of touch. There was just madness and chaos and pandemonium. And I think he wanted to change American politics, to make it into something great. But he found himself in a position of just not being capable of doing that, because he was relying just on him. I alone can fix it. But he had no plan. He had no intentions, and he didn't have enough loyalists surrounding him in order to accomplish much. Well, look where President Pandemonium is now. He has intentionally insulated himself, with a bunch of sycophants who want to do nothing but be yes men to him and are, I believe, conducting elderly abuse by taking advantage of the fact that he's elderly and obviously not 100% there and able and capable. And so there are many other people who are playing shadow government and running the show, where President Pandemonium even admits he has no idea what is going on in the Department of Defense, when some very, very serious implications are coming to light that are going to lead to some very unfortunate outcomes that are going to be a dampening, deep, scarring blemish on the prestige of our nation. And it will require a very delicate process to mend that and to recover from that and to restore the integrities that should be there and would be there if we had people that actually cared about the role and the point of the exercise, instead of wanting to, play with power and then appeal to, the ego of President Pandemonium in order to give him the praise that he needs so that everybody can continue to wield the power that they do without the president, even knowing what's going on. That's not how our government's supposed to run. We are supposed to have people in those positions that are trustworthy and faithful servants to the Constitution, who are there to be in service to the American people and to do right by the American people and to fulfill their role with honor and with a sense of duty, and to do so with, respect for the awesome power that they have, and to take extreme ownership of that duty and the responsibilities, and to know it and own it, so that, the president is just one person. They can't be everywhere all times, but they have to be able to have trustworthy people in those roles that they can delegate, these powers to, so that they can be an extension of what the president is trying to accomplish. But I think that that's being abused by these people who are leaving the president out of the loop of what's happening so that they can do whatever they want and then just tell the president some other story, and the president doesn't know, and he's not fully there. And again, I really believe this is a form of elder abuse conducted by all members of his, of his cabinet. And it's unfortunate because I believe Trump made the same mistake that Biden did. Neither one of these people had the best interest of America at heart by choosing to run for president again. Because neither one of those people had a vision of what they wanted America to be. Just saying that, it's better than another Trump term to have me at least, and I can win out because I beat him once. And, make America great, whatever great means, I personally would rather America do good than to be great. And President Pandemonium let in a bunch of really careless, callous, self-centered deviants into his sphere of influence, welcome them into, made up roles in the government, and gave these people delegated powers, and they destroyed everything that we meticulously and delicately and carefully and consciously created together. Some of the most brilliant minds in political science, social science, economics, and this entire realm of the humanities and the concepts of, the brightest innovators and engineers and crafters of the language of law, and these brilliant minds who interpret the law, these brilliant minds that formulated policies and grew relationships and helped to cultivate our soft power as a nation, which was like the glue that held everything together that we call substance and substantial and significant in terms of like, this is the American identity. All of that, soft, like the software that just makes everything work, that every other nation looks upon and sees as America as this island of coherence. And it makes us trustworthy. And it makes us creditworthy. And it makes us, reliable allies and reasonable confidants and people worth sharing insights and information and resources with. We were trustworthy. And we have abundance. We are a very abundant nation. And I understand we internally have, massive inequality by design. This is no accident. But in large, we are a very abundant country. And just because inefficiencies in systems that have been, by power players coming in, rigging systems into their favor, have eschewed things to force the, entrenchment of inequalities, does not mean that we are not an abundant nation, and that we have to always be so deeply embedded in inequalities. Those things can change by design. And I hope that we will intentionally choose together to pursue an opportunity to shift that, arrangement to make it more just, fair, reasonable, and right for everybody. But we spent so much time building all these things, nearly 250 years of a constituted democratic republic of independence. We made ourselves into this incredible nation. And we have accomplished so much. And we used to be a light unto the nations. We used to be, the prestige of the world. And now people look at us and they see what we're becoming and what we've been led to do and what has been done in our name under the leadership of President Pandemonium. And we have been disgraced, And when we had individuals brought in by President Pandemonium and they, cut off funding for life vital resource in the form of natural resources and, you know, institutionalized resources and scientific resources, and what we've developed in resources in terms of our, um, interrelationships internationally with the globe to help to extend coherence and stability to other nations of the world, because we recognize that as a fortitude for our own national security and our own best interest. Those things were stripped of funding, people were fired, doors were shuttered, and whole organizations were disappeared inside of the umbrella of other organizations and then just neglected until people forgot they even existed anymore. There's been a huge void left by this careless act of carelessness. And in that void, there was a vacuum, and it's being filled up with other nations, in particular China, that's exploiting the fact that America gave up on doing what's right. It gave up on doing good, so they can try to claim they're going to be great. America failed to do good. And now China's coming in, and they are expanding their sphere of influence across the world. And it makes them appear to be the more compelling partners. And that is destabilizing America's standing in the world. And then I think of all of the people who have died. And I want to call it murder because it seems to me like it is. Just because it wasn't some, blunt force trauma to the head doesn't mean that it's any less an intentional death, an avoidable death for so many people across the globe that we used to provide assistance to. And it did not take much from us to do that. But we got so much, multiple fold in return, and goodwill. And that funding cut off, and children died, and people died, and there's suffering, and all of it's unnecessary. And under the guise of patriotism, under the guise of saving money, under the guise of efficiency, callous, careless, self-centered individuals that were misplaced trust in and given the power to just destroy whatever without tact, without care or consideration or thought or even permission from the American people. These people came in with a chainsaw and just cut it all down. And from their actions, as a direct result of their actions, people died. And those people do not have a conscience, and they do not care. And they probably have no trouble sleeping at night, because in their opinion, somebody so many far degrees removed from them on the other side of the world is of no concern to them whether or not they live or they die. All that they were thinking about was the relationship to a decimal point on some spreadsheet to try to create a bottom line figure that could be more solvent. Because America had to be efficient, right? And President Pandemonium allowed that to happen. And then he claimed he didn't know what's happening, but I place trust in these people. And all the hard-working Americans that lost their job. And I cannot fully fathom, though I try as hard as I can to be sympathetic and empathetic to their positions of being caring individuals devoted to service to country and to care for these people, to be told you are not allowed to care for these people anymore, and how much traumatic stress were those people forced to go into, knowing they were not allowed to do their jobs anymore, knowing that their jobs were the reason why so many people were still alive. The only thing standing between life and death for some people were these individuals that worked very hard. And those people were told, you don't have a job anymore. And yeah, not having a job is terribly difficult, and I can imagine the strain that it brought onto their lives, but the moral dilemma that they were forced into, to have to reconcile the fact that no matter how much they care, no matter how much they want to save those people, to protect those people, they were not allowed to. They were denied the capacity. They were denied the right. This is what happens when you have people that don't care in charge of things that require the might of great care. And it is going to take so much intentional, designed, engineered work to redeem the time, to restore the integrities, and to set things right after such trauma and tragedy and craze that was brought upon the American people and other good people of the world, all in the name of money. And that goes back to what I was saying before, like, that's why I have such a hard time reconciling how campaigning to become an elected official requires you to prove your worthiness through your capacity to fundraise for money. Because that is not what matters. Outcomes matter. And I spend so much time praying for the personal day of revelation for all of these people who have come in through POTUS 47's administration, who are right now making the wrong decisions and are being extremely selfish and are causing unnecessary and undue harm to the American people, to the American Constitution, to the U.S. institutions. Our prestige as a nation, our standing in the world, all of these things are just getting eroded. And I cannot see anything about this that's great. There's nothing great about any of this. And I pray for them that they'll have their personal day of revelation and they'll wake up into the consciousness of what they're doing wrong. And they will take on the moral obligation and responsibility to set on the path of redemption, to do the right thing. And I pray for everybody who has the capacity to reach these people, to be an inspiring role model, to help to convince them and to compel them to change their ways before it's too late for them and their souls, but also for America as a nation to be able to redeem the time. I think of, and this is a really hard one for me, I think of recent events of an American soldier, the National Guard, who lost their life, and another that is fighting for their life. And I, of course, continue to pray for peace to come as a result of this tragedy. I don't like that it's been turned into political fodder. I don't like that it has turned into this nasty business of tribalism. Someone lost their life. And I do think to myself, had she been anywhere else at that time, she might still be with us today. And the other gentleman, his life is going to be so much burdened by this event. I can't imagine how he will ever be made whole. I continue to pray for his recovery. This is really hard because I have had friends in the military who lost their lives and who were others who were severely injured, and many who were deeply impacted by the PTSD that just comes with the territory of service. And we fail so many of our veterans and not doing right by them to help to restore them to wholeness and to integrate them back into society. And I think over this event, and it never should have happened. You know? Things could have been different. And an entire nation has been shook to the core. These families, I can sense they would have to feel some sense of betrayal. And a pang inside of fear and frustration. They're going to have to fully internalize the grieving process And what shred of hope do they have to hold on to help to make sense of this whole thing that could help them to reconcile into a full acceptance of this, so that they don't have to grieve their entire lives in misery? Somehow they'll reach a point where they can grieve in acceptance of love and appreciation for the beautiful, wonderful memories that they had. I don't think that there's anything that can be done by anybody outside to set things right, but I do believe the right thing to do would have been for President POTUS 47 to apologize for the deployment of National Guard in cities across the nation, and to give the order to recall everybody back home where they belong, and to accept responsibility for creating a context by which this event was made possible. This was not an accident. This happened as a consequence of the decision-making of POTUS 47 and members in his administration. They created the environment and the context by which this was made possible. And the right step, and the best move, the one small thing that can be done to attempt to set this right, would be to recall all service members out of every city in America, to apologize for deploying National Guard, taking them away from their homes and their families and their jobs and their communities and all of their commitments in order to be deployed in some distant city. Without just cause. And because of that, it led to the unfortunate event, the loss of life, and the significant harm done to another. We as a nation really need to do intentional good work of helping to support each and every one of our governors of every single state and Commonwealth, and make sure that everybody has the resources necessary in order to create a robust, well-trained, set standard of ethics and oversight to have a really good law enforcement, so that every city and every county and every small rural town has the resources that they need in order to create safe space, so that these, public servants in the form of law enforcement can do their job to be public safety officers, to help to work within their communities, just to give everybody a sense that we're safe and we're sound. A lot of reform work needs to be done, and standards need to be set, and training needs to be improved, and funding needs to be appropriated so that there's enough to do a good job. And we need to work hard to restore the integrities of respect for every single one of our police forces. And they need to also be held accountable to the ideals of a standard of ethics to make sure that they are worthy of the trust of the people, so that we can work together to keep our cities safe. That's the better solution than it is to deploy the National Guard. That is a knee-jerk reaction. It's an expedient fix, and look what happens when you make quick decisions and you don't think things through and you don't make a plan. You don't consider what potential risks that you would be forcing others to have to take on. What sort of precarious position are you putting them? What sort of dangers are you placing them in? And not just the National Guard members, but also the people within the cities. It's one thing to see police on your street. I think we all get a little nervous when we see the police because, there's this weird taboo that's been created around it, And I think we have to do intentional work to fix that. That's up to all of us to do. But that's also there to kind of remind us, like, oh, we have somebody that has our back, that's looking out for us in our best interest, to keeping us safe, keeping us sound, And for us to have a sense that we know we're going to be okay. And that's what we need in our cities. Because when you see police, it should be reassuring. Everything's okay, Somebody's looking out for our collective best interest. It's a totally different thing to see somebody, in a police uniform than it is to see somebody in, a military uniform, in fatigues or BDUs or ACUs or whatever they're dressed in. It sends a different signal. And you're instilling fear in everyday people. You're not instilling confidence. You're normalizing to people that have no say in this matter. They just have to adapt to this. And it's uncomfortable and it's weird. Like, we shouldn't be seeing this. Isn't our nation better than this? Have we really come to this? Especially in a lot of these cities, things are not perfect. Again, we really, really need to work on improving our public safety, which is not just about improving, law enforcement, but also making sure we have, a robust system of first responders. Our cities need to be improved for livability, habitability, and beautification. All of these things are dynamic factors that play on each other to help to give people a sense that this is a safe place. And you just naturally abide by the laws because this is a civil society and I must be civil, and we all conduct our civics, and we all reinforce and inculcate social and civic ideals with one another. We want to live in good places, so we have to be good people. We reinforce that in those positive ways. Development, not in force and intimidation and threat, And on the other side of that, I read an article from an individual that was a part of a program that was trying to assist the gentleman who has been arrested and accused of allegedly committing this, heinous crime. And in this article was explaining the situation of that individual And I know that some people in POTUS 47's administration are trying to suggest that this individual is radicalized and that this is some sort of like threat. They're going to get to the bottom of it and figure it out. And they're bringing this atmosphere of fear even more so. And I'm sure they're doing that because they need that fear so they can justify what they're doing. It's like, see, everything's terrible, so you need us to be there, even though things got this terrible because you decided to take an extreme measure, beyond what is just, fair, reasonable, or right, and you created a context in which bad things happened as a result of your poor decision making and terrible leadership and lack of forethought, care, and concern. But in reading this article about this gentleman and hearing about his story about he was having a really tough time integrating into America, and that likely he suffered PTSD from his service to this country in the operation in Afghanistan, and that having struggles with the language and struggles with holding a job and providing for his family, and he went further and further into isolation. And I don't think that he was radicalized. To me, it seems like he was in a very vulnerable state. And then you have something that's very extreme. Presence of, military on the streets. I'm sure that caused him to have a well up of the fear of what it was like when he was in Afghanistan. And that in that moment he made the wrong decision. And I'm sure there were many factors that led to that happening. But what I heard in that article and reading about his story, and knowing that I don't know him entirely, but I do know this piece, it seems that even on his end, this could have been preventable. If we had an immigration system that didn't, demonize people from other countries, if you don't speak English, or if you have brown skin or black skin, or, you look like you're not white American, there is this entire culture and atmosphere that's created of a sensing that you don't belong unless you fit this pretty little categorization, this ideal representation of what is American. And I see many people that are obviously here, coming here from other countries, and I don't know why they're here, but in my opinion, they belong just as much as everybody else does. They're working jobs, or they're, being patrons at stores, they're walking along the street, pushing their children in strollers, walking their dogs, just trying to get along. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I can imagine how actually very truly difficult it must be for them to constantly have to look over their shoulders and worry and wonder, are you a person who's going to accept me? Are you going to attack me? Are you going to tell me that I need to leave this nation? Where are you from? And now even more so, you have ICE running around everywhere, stopping anybody that doesn't look, are you American? Where are you from? And abducting people randomly off the street while they're wearing masks. I can imagine how absolutely stressful this time must be for people that are from other countries that have come here, regardless of their status. Just being here is a frightening experience. And so bring all of that together, the intense pressure, the worry, the concern, the always looking over your shoulders and wondering, are you going to be kidnapped and forced to go somewhere else? How terrified this individual must have been if he thought that this National Guard person might have swooped him up and sent him over to ICE, and then he would have been, mistaken, and then they wouldn't have read his papers and understood he was here lawfully, and then try to take him and send him back to Afghanistan, where he would be led to certain death because, he gave everything up to come here to be in service to our nation. He helped to protect our soldiers over there and to provide us with intel and these sorts of things. So I can imagine the intensity, and to disregard that fact that this individual likely has PTSD from that experience in his service, and then on top of it, the PTSD added on with the heightened intensity of aggressive and violent hate towards immigrants that is fomenting in America, that is being signaled by POTUS 47 himself and his entire administration. Hate immigrants, they're the bad hombres, we got to get them out here, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars to out process these people and build concentration camps. What a terrifying time. That's PTSD right there. It will give you traumatic stress, and coping with that's got to be really difficult. So POTUS 47 first creates the conditions of stress and trauma and anxiety and fear and doubt and uncertainty, looking over your shoulder, always wondering, not knowing whether you're safe, and then creates a presence of intimidation, and then deploys a bunch of people to, swoop people up off of the streets, creating the conditions by which you're pitting people in a corner of desperation. And then you can't anticipate what somebody is going to do in that situation. And knowing from being a caregiver of veterans, many of them, every single one of them, with PTSD, and knowing the fragility of their state of being, and from minute to minute their state of mind could trigger into this uncontrollable, outburst of trying to somehow touch base with reality. When you have this awash of these embedded events of trauma that come flooding back in, and then you try to figure out how to make sense of the world and just touch base with reality. Many times I had to just sit there and hold their hand and just assure them it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. We're here and we're safe, we're good. We made it back, it's okay. And I can't imagine that in a moment of trigger event and pushed into this corner by forces of intimidation and fear, that any person put into that situation would be desperate and not thinking fully. And this is in no way trying to excuse, this is in no way trying to say that, there does not need to be consequences to, this tragic event. There absolutely needs to be. But instead of it being, damning and punitive and singling everybody out from that nation, all of a sudden they're all bad and they all need to go and they all need to be scrutinized even more and then put even more in a corner and pressure them and traumatized further, which is exactly what POTUS 47 is doing. The correct response would be treat this as an isolated situation and really understand the factors that came to be. Where were the pressures coming in? How was this person dealing with their PTSD? How were they being integrated back into society? Based off of this article that I read, there were not enough support systems for any of these individuals that came over here who had to go through a significant vetting process in order to get here. It is actually laughable for this administration to try to suggest that, this was not intensive. There are so many people who went through so much in order to qualify, and then, in Trump's administration, the first time got cut off and weren't allowed to come over, despite the fact that they qualified, more than qualified, because Trump has some sort of bias against people of certain races and certain nations of origin. He does not see the individual, he doesn't see the person, and he doesn't care. And if you did care, you cared to learn the story of this individual who was brought to this situation where he committed this heinous crime, allegedly, that resulted in this unnecessary loss of life and this traumatic event that this individual is going to have to, God may he please, make it through, but to have to live his entire life not being able to be made whole, which any person who's been, themselves a veteran or a wounded warrior or a caregiver for them or a family member for one of them understands the significant toll that it takes on your life. And how it is a lifelong process of trying to make yourself whole again. It is very difficult. And instead of trying to figure out what happened and why, and really learn from every error and every mistake that happened and try to find the weak points, the points in which a decision was made that could have been, led in a different path. And what were the circumstances that led to the decision going the wrong way? And even also finding out, how much worse it could have been. And take those into consideration and find innovative ways to solve that out so we don't become in this situation again. POTUS 47 thinks the answer is to send more National Guard, to be even more discriminatory towards people from Afghanistan, and to use the full force of the law against that person and just, attack them because they're a bad person and they must suffer, punishment, to make that whole situation even worse for that individual. I believe in every circumstance, all victims and all perpetrators must be made whole. That is the only way to create a corrective system. That is the only way to achieve true justice. And POTUS 47 and his administration, they just don't get that. They don't care. They don't care about you. They don't care about anything except for themselves and their capacity to get away with cruelty. And they create more problems than they fix. And then when they create a problem and they fix the problem that they created, they try to say, see, we're fixing stuff. In reality, when you look at it and you distill it down, they have really not accomplished very much. They've gotten pretty far in the progress of Project 2025, which, if anybody read it, and I hope people have, they realize it's a recipe for disaster. It really is. Good people of the world would never want an America that would come as a result of fulfilling the things in Project 2025. It's a plan of destruction, when right now what we need is construction. And I understand why Trump, embraced it, because he has no plan himself. He's not a planner, He knows how to build buildings or tell people how to build buildings or whatever. He's a real estate person. And there is planning to that, and there's design, and there's thinking, and there's care, and there's consideration. So it's not like he's inept and incapable of these things, but he doesn't know how to translate that over into other areas of concern, especially when it comes to, he doesn't know how to write policy. That's why instead of getting pragmatic policies that are implemented in just the right time and the right way to help to reinforce the development of like a scaffolding in order to help to right the ship of state, realign the nation towards a direction towards progress that's good for good outcomes. They just came out with one big bill and just said, we're going to do all of this all at once. Clean sweep, massive thing, chainsaw, cut everything up. And the results have been disaster. It's heyday and happiness for all the rich people who have been finally get their spoons, IOUs they can cash in, and they get their tax breaks. In the meantime, all of the social safety nets that are helping people keep their heads just barely afloat above the rising floods of expense of life that is becoming increasingly unaffordable. All of those safety nets have now been taken away, and people are starting to sink under the weights and the pressures of things getting worse and worse, And things are only going to continue to get worse. We have some huge shifts in industries. The next industrial revolution is coming through, and it is going to be such an alteration of our way of life, and we're so ill prepared for it. And POTUS 47 is not doing anything to prepare us for it, And he's so busy distracting everybody with his mayhem and his controversy and his cruelty and his corruption, and his self-profiting and his grandstanding and his, continuum spectacle of negative consequence. And the mess-ups and the mistakes, that him and people in his administration are continuously making, their failures. The news cycle is constantly bringing up things of like, guess what stupid thing they did today, because they don't know what they're doing. Or they do know what they're doing and they're intentionally messing things up because they get a kick out of being cruel. Because they can post it on social media and get lots of likes. Because people have been conditioned, to like drama and craze and to look for the next, hit of a sense of, euphoric endorphins that go in, sense of like, I've owned the libs today, ha ha ha, and it makes you feel good for a second. Those things are fleeting and shallow. It's of no substance, but that's all that POTUS 47 really has to give. And when you listen to him, when he sits down and has interviews with people, it's, pointing fingers and blame game and a lot of I don't know and I'm not aware and, pardoning people and he doesn't even know who he's pardoning. And, a lot of those people who he pardoned were bad actors with nefarious intent, who their victims will never be made whole now. And many of the people who he's pardoned has gone on to commit further crimes. And those crimes would have been avoidable had there just been care and concern by, legal counsel that would have said, considering a pardon for this person, we really have to take into account, is this person going to come back into society and fully integrate? Have they learned their lesson? Or is this just an opportunity for them to, get out of jail free card? And POTUS 47 definitely treats America like this is a game of Monopoly. and the corruption and how his family's profiting off of the presidency is one of the things I have the hardest time reconciling in my heart, because I don't want for anybody to not succeed at life, in pursuing their talents, in finding a way to actualize, their best version. But I also see when people are dealing in corruption and backroom deals and handshakes as dollars, and doing so by, capitalizing on POTUS's role in his family, getting money and investments and, deals with other countries and things like that. That actually undermines the integrity of our nation. It literally devalues our nation. It destabilizes our nation. And it makes it so that the role of POTUS is put higher in the level of consideration for our sovereignty than it's supposed to be. We are a nation of we, the people, of, by, and for the people. And POTUS 47 has ascended himself into this role of, because he says so, he runs the show and everything passes through him, and he needs to get something personally in return. In order for other countries, you got to pay to play with him. And that's wrong, because now imagine what's going to happen when he's no longer in office. Those countries are going to either look to America and expect that the promises made by POTUS 47 is going to have to be upheld, and if not, then we're put in a precarious position with those people. Or that we no longer have the respect of, a nation of integrity, and so these other places believe they can just walk all over us, just like they're doing to POTUS 47. They're exploiting him and his desire for money, power, and influence, and, ego praise and these sorts of things. He's very easily manipulated in his desire to want a Nobel Peace Prize. The best way for him to earn a Nobel Peace Prize would be to stand on integrity and to ensure that our NATO alliance is strong and it's fortified, and to stand with Ukraine, and to draw a line in the sand for Israel, and to demand a two-state solution, and to demand the restoration of integrities across the world, to no longer allow people to pick on the smaller nations. We should be holding up to the sense that we are the leader of the free world, and that we want to extend freedom to as many people as is possible, because their freedom secures our freedom. This is a mutualism, mutual interests, mutual benefits, mutual securities, mutual respects. And if we operate off of that, that's the best, foreign policy stance to go. It's the best domestic policy stance, But unfortunately, all those things are on very faulty ground, destabilized because of Trump's corruption and his family's corruption of the entire systems of integrities that our nation is dependent upon in order for us to remain well respected and revered. The idea of being strong through the capacity to force or enforce is a very exhaustive, very expensive position to be in. If you're trying to, be the superpower of the world, doing so by force is very exhausting, But with a gentle touch and that soft power and that sense that we're all in this together and we care about your freedom because that is a reinforcement of our freedom, that instills a sense of fidelity and loyalty that is so deep. It is so compelling. That is the root of consensus. That is stronger than even the will, because it's a devotion to something that is much bigger than any one of us. It's a faithfulness to that. And when somebody is, in a communion with that, with fidelity to this ideal of something that's much bigger than any one of us can achieve alone, that draws a strength and a resilience and a persistence and a fortitude and an endurance in people that wells up from a place of their truth, of what matters the most to them. You cannot get that from people through fear and intimidation and force. No order that you give to anybody could ever compel somebody to go against their soul print values. And a lot of the people that I know who have joined the military took an oath to the Constitution, not to the president. And they promised to uphold the law. And it's unfortunate that POTUS 47 would even put service members in a difficult position for faithfulness to their country and suspicion that they're being exploited by their government. I don't really know how they plan on getting enough people to sign up for joining the military under these conditions. Knowing that, POTUS 47 and his, Department of Defense is putting soldiers in dangers and harm's way, has led to the death of a soldier on American soil while in service. They died in the line of duty on American soil. When was the last time that ever happened with any other president? And then conducting, acts of war without Congress approval against a nation that they've singled out for reasons that don't seem justified at all. Without, giving any proof or reasonable justifications. And have conducted things that seem quite on its face as being murder. And if there is this supposed war on drugs, it's a war crime. And for us to even have to consider, is that what's happening here is not a good place for our country to be in. And then the fact that POTUS 47 in the Department of Defense is trying to deny their way out of it and lie and deceive and to blame other people. Like, who in their right mind would sign up for the military knowing that, the leader of the free world, the commander in chief, is going to pin everything that you're forced to do because you were ordered to do, and they're going to pin everything on you, and then you're going to have to live with the consequences, not just the, crime consequences of it, but also the personal consequences of knowing that you made the decision to take that action, and it is your duty to uphold the Constitution, and it is your duty to not follow unlawful orders. I can't see anybody intentionally signing up for such a military, such dysfunction and deception and unreasonable expectations, and putting them in terrible predicaments. Soldiers and military personnel are not just warm bodies filling a position. They are not tools to use to engage in war games or to play political games. And on the subject of, if the justification for blowing up ships and killing people from a distance without giving them any due process or providing any proof that there was an imminent risk or danger or threat to America, I don't see the justification of saying that this is some sort of intent to, stop drugs and this is a war on drugs, because there is no domestic policy that is reflecting a sense of care, concern, or urgency to solve for the problems, at home. And I understand trying to go after a root cause sort of thing, but they're not doing the root cause. If they're just blowing up people who are transporters, there's many more, agents that involve in that, They didn't just magically pick up these packages from nowhere. They didn't manifest magically, and so there's root sources to it that they're not even really going after. And they say that they may be doing, land missions or whatever. But I could imagine they would have gotten more insights into where to go and how to do it with precision, and an actual directive for their mission, instead of just blow them all out of the water or whatever, but like an intentional directive, a mission that everybody can get behind because they understand what the point of the exercise is, to, eradicate these, problems at the, point of source. But again, there is no reasonable justification for that, seen as that, there's many other places that are conducting, drug trafficking, and they're not under attack with such intensity. And so it seems unreasonable to suggest that that's what they're going after. And then, POTUS 47 gave a pardon to one of the, largest drug traffickers America has ever, been able to convict. And that person was only in a year into a 48-year sentence for bringing in hundreds of tons of drugs into America. So it doesn't equate, that this is about some sort of care and concern about protecting the American people from drugs. And, if you really cared about protecting the American people from drugs, it's not just about preventing them from coming in the first place, because that's, a lot of factors that are beyond our control. But what is in our control is to creating the circumstances and situations for Americans that are living here to the point where they can make better decisions with their lives and don't get entangled in using drugs. There's so much that we can do to help to improve the lives of everyday Americans, that help them to make better choices. People don't turn to drugs when they have fulfilling lives, they just don't. And then a lot of people get caught up in that stuff because it's kind of like the concept of idle hands, ain't got nothing better to do. What more does somebody in the hood have to do, but dealing drugs? Not saying that's the case, a generalization or something like that, but it's just saying, like, it only makes sense if that's the only opportunity that they can find, that's what they're going to fall into. Create better opportunities, and that problem will cease to exist. And in the meantime, all of those people that have been caught up in drugs, create more care centers. Rehabilitation is possible, and it can be a beautiful personal development experience. And if we care to build the facilities and to staff them with caring, compassionate people, and we give people a positive path to self-recovery and redemption. There's so many beautiful stories of recovery that I have learned over the years. Personally knowing somebody who ran a recovery treatment center and spending hours talking to them and understanding what they went through in order to run such a facility, and how their patients were cared for and the people were able to recover, and understanding the shortfalls in it, a lot of it having to do with just not appropriate funding and not enough facilities, not enough caregivers. And those are all things that we can invest more into. And it would solve for the problem of, people who did get caught up in drugs to be able to get clean and then to stay clean. That would do so much more in terms of solving the drug problem in America than it would for stuff coming in. Because guess what? Doesn't matter how much junk you bring in, if people don't find a use for it, it'll go to waste. And they're no longer going to bring that stuff here because what's the point? If we create such a conditions to where people don't feel that's not even interesting, it's less likely that will happen. And I'm not saying that's a perfect process, because we will also have to do stuff to prevent, get it at the source and to secure our borders. Absolutely. But it would have to take a comprehensive plan to do all that, and none of those things seem in line with the approach that POTUS 47 is taking. I think that they're trying to do some bad things, and they're trying to cover it up, and using, war on drugs as a cover up. And it's unfortunate because that's exploiting the military. It's using our military service members as tools to do evil. It's wasting resources. Which, this administration, POTUS 47, President Pandemonium, is really good at wasting resources. Time, money, effort, energy, all the money that's being spent on, punitive, fear-mongering, immigration enforcement. All of that could be used to instead do the very thing that, as I was alluding to earlier, that gentleman from Afghanistan that is accused of making that very poor decision of causing harm to two of our service members, killing one and significantly harming another. You know, if he had the appropriate services to help to fully integrate, you know, none of this would have been possible, you know, or at least there was hope and there was a chance that none of this could have happened. If you just gave him a different situation to involve himself with, you know, a welcoming situation he could have thrived on, you know, he wouldn't have been led to the point where, you know, he made that terrible decision. And there's many other immigrants that are in that same situation. There's many people who are here that have been integrated in our society for so long. They have positively contributed and participated. They have families, they have homes, they have jobs, they have companies, you know, they have possessions, you know, they have homes, and they've made relationships with family and friends and neighborhoods, and they're part of our communities. They're our friends and our neighbors. And they're being swooped up off of the street. Excuse me. I remember reading this story about this young lady that was trying to go home from college to go and surprise her parents for Thanksgiving, and she was caught up by ICE in the airport and was carted away to Honduras, even though she had a court order saying that she couldn't be removed. You know, POTUS 47 and his administration and DHS, they don't follow the law. They disregard it, you know. And I mean, it's so frustrating. You know, law is lawless in this country because of POTUS 47 and his regime. But this young lady, you know, her hopes and dreams were stolen away. She was going to school to better her life, to become something so much more than, you know, she was before. And she could have been such a great contributor to our society. And her entire life was taken from her. Why? Why? For cruelty? For the spectacle that they were able to get? You know? For another, you know, count to be able to show, you know, the MAGA people, see, we're rounding them up, guys, and we're getting them out of here. But each one of those tally marks is a real person with a life. And however small and insignificant the numbers of the individuals out of all that have been rounded up, that are actually, you know, bad actors with nefarious intent, does not justify the massive amount of resources that have been used to round everybody up and build up concentration camps and direct resources away from doing actual law enforcement. You know, child trafficking, nobody working on that. They're all working on immigration. You know, people that are, you know, working to prevent drug trafficking, nope, can't work on that. Gotta work on immigration. The diversion of resources to go towards immigration, creating this, you know, sense of fear for everybody, intimidating, and, you know, millions of dollars spent on advertisements to intimidate people and to make it seem like, see, we're doing something, guys. It is such a spectacle, and it's utterly disgusting. You know, you have the leader of DHS who is taking every opportunity to exploit the power in that position and to project as if they're doing something, you know, that's a noble cause, and it's not. It does not make America safer. Want to know how? I know. Like what happened in Washington, D.C. with the 2 National Guard members who were shot. It was one individual that did that. But now DHS is trying to punish everybody that's from Afghanistan. That's wrong. But creating that culture of fear and then, villainizing them so the MAGA base gets all angry at them. So now when, they see somebody that looks like they're from Afghanistan on the street, they're going to be angry and use hatred and violence towards them. Who's doing the radicalization here? It seems like the government, POTUS 47's federal government, is radicalizing the entire nation to become more and more violent and extreme. I've invested a lot of time considering what could be done to help to make immigration the prestige of our nation again. And even a fraction of what is being wasted right now to do this violent approach and cruel approach to, throw people out, lock people up, separate families, traumatize children, deprive our nation of good people, hard workers, devoted caregivers, to separate families. Just cruelty. A fraction of what is being spent to do all of that, and all these, thousands upon thousands of dollars of bonuses for these ICE agents who are able to, cover their faces and go do violence against other people. And all of the people who are taking advantage of that, who are actual bad actors with nefarious intent, who are not ICE agents, that are out doing that type of crime on the streets and not being held accountable to it. Who knows how many innocent lives have been affected negatively by this? People who have just been disappeared completely. How many people have died, literally died, as a result of this administration's actions? They are human rights violations for a fraction of all the money that has been wasted, because it's all waste. We could have built up a robust golden door of opportunity for immigrants to be welcomed into, and a legitimate pathway of integration so they can feel like they are welcome members of our society, and give them a chance to bring their best. And they're not taking away from us. They're helping us become so much more than what we could be without them. They make us a better nation. And just like happens anywhere, when you have a greater population, there is an increased chance of bad actors with nefarious intent that's going to be in the mix somewhere. But you don't penalize everybody and punitively punish everybody, that looks like somebody that might be doing something wrong. You might be a bad hombre. You don't profile people and say you look like you're a criminal. You do law enforcement. Increase our public safety, make our streets safer. Help make sure everybody just keeps an eye out for one another. And to make our, criminal justice system be, robust, and to make sure that our corrective system is actually about correction, and then try approaching the root causes of things. A lot of people come to America because There is no opportunity anywhere else, and it's unsafe. There's a lot of violence proliferating across the world. You know, that was where our soft power came from. That's what USAID was doing a lot of good work to keep America safe by creating stability and little islands of coherence in other places so people could just stay where they're from. Because it's not like there are people that come here because America is like going to heaven, or at least it used to be. But many people just want to stay home, but they know that they can't. Because there's nothing there that they could build a life on. And they want for the best for themselves and their children, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, and they can't all come here, and we don't want them all to be here, and they don't all want to come here, and they don't all want to stay. But what other options do they have? And that's where we can come to be of service to our fellow human beings. You know, we're not saying let's give them everything that we have so we have nothing. It's like, let's make sure that we have enough, that we can share our abundance with others to make sure that they have enough, so that while, yes, it's very compelling, our nation is, but they have compelling things in their home nations too. And the more good people that choose to stay in those nations, the more safe and sound and stable and secure they would be. So it becomes a good place to raise a family. You know, we can help them to achieve opportunities. And I have considered, you know, our immigration as having these different treks for getting people to integrate into America. And some of those treks are about just coming here, skill build, go back home, and help to, you know, bring what you learned here back home so you can make a difference. But times are changing, and we're going to need a lot of people to help us to improve our situation so that we can shift with the changing tides that are on the way. I believe that we should embed the stewardship archetype into the American identity so that we can identify as being stewards as a nation. That's what we stand for. That's what we're about. That's what we're doing here. It's the whole point of the exercise. And have the sense that our purpose is to become welfaring stewards. We're stewarding the welfaring of people, of our nation, and of other nations, and of the planet. And here in America, you know, we're all about, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, that's what we're in it to win, you know? And how do we do that? Well, we laid it out pretty simply in our preamble to the Constitution. I call it the preamble promise. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. We ordained our Constitution, and that's who we are. We're nothing without our Constitution. And that preamble promise is, you know, what we're trying to get at. That's all we have to work towards, are those things. How we do it is the interesting part. And that's where policy comes in. That's where governance comes in. How do you figure this is all going to work? You know, the question at the beginning of all this is like, who? Who out of all this, you know, has a way to get us out of this mess? I really believe that welfaring stewardship is a way to accomplish that. It gives us projects, and it gives us objectives. It gives us clear schedules and timelines. You know, It gives us a sense of what we're working towards and how we intend to get there. You know, what are our goals? What are the sorts of things that we won't stand for? And to get everybody involved to work in their own ways to accomplish this together. And it gives us finally something to believe in that isn't about, you know, party ideologies. It's really about what it's going to take in order to create a secure situation that everybody can thrive on. It is really literally the way that we can make America work for 100% of the people here. And to do it in the shortest time possible, and to do so without ecological offense, making sure that we do this without the disadvantage of anybody, so that nobody gets left behind or kept behind, and that everybody lives the good life. It's not a radical notion, and it's not, you know, impossible. It is definitely in the realm of possibility. And it's going to take work. We're going to have to get our hands dirty, and we're all going to have to actively participate and contribute. But it's worth it. And it's so much better than, you know, trying to take these ideological, you know, factioning and dividing each other and splitting each other apart. You know, make America great. You know, make America turn away from Trump. Like, we have better things to concern ourselves about than those things that just, the big picture, don't matter. Don't matter. You know? We have to prepare for the future, and we have to build up the necessary supports in order to get us through. We have to establish a proper economy, proper capitalistic economy that has a proper intended use, and that's to achieve welfare and stewardship. We have to take on the responsibilities of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were authored by the United Nations is a brilliant framework for us to be able to understand how to organize ourselves around, you know, an ideal, you know, way of being, an ontology that we can live by, that's reasonable, just, fair, right. You know, it'll build goodwill and better friendships. It's based off of truth and trust. We'll create more trust, you know. And it's something that, you know, we can metric, so we can prove to ourselves that it's worth it over time. You know, and then we need to stay within the planetary boundaries, because our planet is a living organism, and we are, you know, like, part of it, you know, and without it, we don't exist. There is no planet B. And no matter how much money you throw into trying to make a planet B, or how many Earth's planetary resources you try to steal away, you know, in exchange for pointless green pieces of paper in relationship to a decimal point, you will never be able to make a sustainable, you know, place off planet Earth that will ever be comparable to the magnificent, beautiful, natural planet Earth that we have. You know, nothing can replace planet Earth, and so we have to take care of it, or it will not be able to take care of us. You know, good Mother Earth is here to care for us if we care for her. And it's not too much to expect that we should be stewards of our planet, and that we should steward civilization in such a way that can live in accordance with a healthy, thriving planet. And that we steward society in such a way that we are, you know, advancing our civilization in such a way that is in the best interest of advancing humanity to achieve, you know, its most evolved suprahuman state as is possible, without losing our core humanity. And then we need to steward our nations and our states and our communities and our neighborhoods and our own homes and our own lives. And when we get a sense that that's what we're working towards, then we kind of, have a rough draft map that's outlined, and we have to fill in the details of the geography and, but we at least have an idea of where we are. And if we have plans to develop out for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 30 years, next 100 years, next 1,000 years, then we have a sense of when we are on that scale. And when we have a vision of what's to come and where we're going, what we're trying to achieve, and we share that vision with one another, and we all understand where we are and how far we are along in our progress, that gives us all something to build consensus about. And we're no longer infighting about what cultural differences of opinions, tastes, and aversions. That's the diversity of our humanity that makes things interesting and fun, right? But those are not the things that should be separating us, or dividing us, or factioning us. They're the things that should be uniting us, recognizing, like, we don't all belong together so close, everybody has their own tribe. We all do belong here in our own, place of belonging, and there's more than enough room to make space for everyone, and just to create a welcoming situation that everybody can thrive on. There's nothing wrong with that. I believe that one of the best ways to achieve this is to have a new instigation of integrity installed into American governance. Because if we've learned anything from POTUS 47, is that our governance is really fragile, and that it can be hijacked by, an ideological demagogue, who has no idea what he's doing, and a bunch of people that are just totally fine with breaking everything and, don't care about the consequences that everybody else has to pay. And that exploiters, bad actors with nefarious intent, will exploit any weakness and vulnerability, and they will take advantage of the situation in order to personally profit, and it will be at the expense of everybody else. We can't have that anymore. We need to weed out that corruption. We need to have anti-corruption mechanisms installed in our government, and we need to make this a more direct democracy. We need to give power back to the people by giving them real power, our true seat at the table. We do that by establishing a fourth branch of government called civics, and it's every American is a relevant stakeholder and has a seat at the table. Their voice gets heard. They are able to, they have a seat at the table, they have skin in the game, they have agency, they have resource, they have capital. We're all in this together. And then tied in with personal dominion, where we stop infighting about trying to dictate other people's lives and whether they can, I don't believe that the government should be able to tell people what to do, what to think, and what to feel. You shouldn't be able to micromanage someone's personhood. It's about personal dominion. It's about freedom. It's about liberty. It's about your pursuit of happiness. And as so long as you're not harming other people's lives, to each their own. And we should have an insulary protection of our personal dominion to make sure that other people can't come in and deny us our personal happiness or our sense of self or our own, life pursuits, because it doesn't fit into their ideological frameworks. We need to have protections for individuals, We also need to make sure the government can't come in and, deny somebody their personhood. And that's what personal dominion's about. Now with that, we no longer have to have, you know, questions of whether or not abortion is right or it's wrong, or, who can and who can't and under what circumstances. That is a personal dominion decision. Leave it to the people to make their own life decisions and to not deny them the chance for personal health care. In the case of, same-sex marriage, that has nothing to do with anybody except for the people who are in union with one another and their creator. And if other people have a personal problem with that, that's their problem. But their problem doesn't need to make it into a situation that everybody else has to now deal with, Things like that, personal dominion is giving us what we need in order to be able to truly define ourselves as a democratic republic of independence. The insular protection of the independent individual gives us the opportunity to create safe space for everybody to become self-sufficient, self-sustaining, free and independent people, self-reliant, but in interdependence with other independent people. So we can rely on people and trust in one another. And for everybody just to focus on your own life and get your own act together, instead of worrying about what other people are doing. There's plenty of things about personal self-development that you could be accomplishing if you just stop worrying about what other people are doing. If it is your area of concern and it is of collective mutual interest, and if we're trying to do something to help to protect everybody, yes, we need to have a moderating influence intervene on our behalf or intercede on our behalf. But never should there be a point in time where other people can come in and tell you who you have to be. Personal dominion is an insular protection of the individual in society. Just like local government is an insular protection, state government, insular protection, federal government, insular protection, all from the next order, above that. And that the ultimate power in America should always rest with the individual. And to really emphasize that, I think having a civics branch of government and personal dominion helps us to establish the independence that we really truly need in order to take back the power of we, the people. And for us to recognize the other and ourselves as being a part of that us that makes the United States. You know what I'm saying? Respecting other people, respecting yourself, knowing that you are a part of something much bigger than yourself alone. These are things that help us to stay united. Then the cultural differences, the tastes and the aversions, these sorts of things, we're always going to have them. There's going to be differences of opinions, there's going to be conflicts of interests, and we have to have problem-solving solutions to answer for that. But that's just the joy of trying to get along with one another, It should never be something that's just so crazy and controversial and to the point where, people are fighting and rioting in the streets over the differences of opinions on matters, I think there's certain things that, like somebody who's pro-life should absolutely have the opportunity to voice their opinion on that and to bring forth whatever they have that's compelling to convince others that that is a good model of a way of life. But that person should never have the power over another individual to determine whether or not they can make a personal life decision about their own personal health care. Because this other person will never have to face the consequences of it. And they don't know. They don't know what the situation is for that individual. Only the individual knows, and their doctor. And that's where it should be kept, is between, their healthcare professional and the individual who's living the experience, And all options should be on the table for that. We shouldn't deny people healthcare that is vital and necessary. There is a scientifically proven necessity for the healthcare capacity, the professional capacity, the institutional capacity, the instrumental capacity to perform abortions is necessary for adequate and appropriate healthcare. It saves lives. And in my personal opinion, that if a life cannot live outside of a womb independently on its own without supports, then it's not a viable life. And so there is no moral conflict or dilemma as to whether or not, if the choice was to not continue to the point where that is a viable, vital life, that there is no moral dilemma in that choice. And I very much believe in life choice, and that we have scientific proof and support to suggest that it really is in the best interest of helping to preserve and protect the life of a mother to have that option on the table and viably accessible to everybody. It's a robust part of healthcare system. But when we have the ancillary protections of personal dominion, it makes sure things like that, like those types of personal life choices, are in the hands of the individual. And that only in the most compelling circumstances does the government have the capacity to intervene on behalf of the individual. Like in the case of abortion. If that life is vital and can live outside of the womb without the support of the mother, abortion shouldn't happen, of course, right? So that would be the point where the government can intervene and say, there's a limit to this, right? Beyond this point, you can't. And we've had abortion legalized and has operated in that manner for a very long time. Roe v. Wade really empowered us to help to save lives and to help women to have the power of personal choice. And the other side of it, of a sense of moral dilemma of, that it promotes promiscuity or something like that. Let's just face the facts that we are sexualized creatures, and that especially in this day and age, we really need to break down the taboo around sexuality in order to make sure that we have a healthy relationship with our sexuality for ourselves and for each other and our social creatures that we are. And this will go a long way to help to protect innocence from being preyed upon by perverts, and will help us to be able to be more mature about the situation, better understands our bodies and our biology. It will help us to be able to be more responsible and more able to be, in the process of procreation, and then able to support systems so that people can have more children, the social scaffolding of lives for people to grow their families, so that they're left with more options in terms of there really is potential. I really can do this. I don't have to take into consideration, like, how could I ever possibly raise a child in this world, Give people the compelling situation, and their choice may be to continue on, to have that life become vital, and then to be born into this world and welcome into the experience, and to bless us all. And there's nothing stopping us from having that type of future and to building out for it and to helping to support people to grow their families. It's going to take a lot of social, integration and work. Welfaring stewardship is very much about that. I believe it starts with the home and empowering people to have safe home spaces and to do, personal development and childhood development and creating robust new forms of education and all of these things create this robust system of being able to raise your children in happy, healthy environments. And that would go so much farther of inspiring people to have children than ever would it be to try to threaten them with damnation for, trying to convince them that, like, life begins at conception. A bacteria is a life, fungi is a life, and these sorts of things. You can't be a hypocrite and say that you're perfectly, fine with people getting the death sentence, but, you're completely against somebody having, an abortion because it's necessary to save their life. If there is not a vital life that they are aborting, you know what I'm saying? So it helps us to do away with a lot of that, and it helps us focus on more important things, like creating the conditions for people to grow their families and to focus on that, and let the few people who choose to not go through that or that need to have an abortion in order to save their lives, like those people have what they need in order to live the life that they believe is their pursuit of happiness. Because all of that is based off a decision within their own personal dominion. They are the ones in control. They are the ultimate decision makers of their lives, not other people, And then all the rest of it goes into the realm of culture. So let's, convince each other, through conversation and debate and example and, congregating and these sorts of things, convince people through culture and things like that to, maybe adhere to your certain types of ideologies or your religious beliefs and things like that. It's fine to try to convince people of that, but not to condemn them or to force them or to deny them in their own personal choices. You know what I'm saying? I also think it's pretty hypocritical for people who are in religion to try to strip away the free will rights of individuals when their God itself does not deny humans free will. So I think that obviously we need to have laws and rules in order to have order in society and have civil society. I mean, in the Christian religion, God even gave commandments to say, this is how to live, in accordance with a good and decent life. People break that stuff all the time, God still forgives. It's not about being perfect. It's about the constant process of perfection and for the individual to determine for themselves what's right for them. That's their karma. Let them live through that experience and learn from it themselves. The best that you can do is to help to guide people and to hope that they'll make the right decision, but it's not up to you to force them to live their life your way. You know what I'm saying? We need to have rules, we need to have regulations, and we need to create safe space and safe environment for people, and we need to make sure that we have social and civic ideals, and we have laws, rules, and norms, cultural ideals. All of these things are good and necessary, but because of how extreme things can get sometimes, and how the government can infringe on the liberties of individuals and go beyond what they actually have power to do, we need to have that ancillary protection of personal dominion, and we need to be able to have a check and balance on the federal state government because of the fact that they sometimes take powers that they don't actually have. The Constitution reserves the rights in the 9th and 10th Amendment that the ultimate powers rest with the people. And that's really where the root source of justification for a fourth branch of government in the form of civics really comes from. It says, power is with the people ultimately. Executive only gets the power that is written within the Constitution. What is reserved in the Constitution is the power that it has. And then the powers that the constitutions of the state has is reserved to them. And they must abide by the federal Constitution. And then ultimately all powers that are not reserved for the federal or the state rest with the people, and that those don't have to be enumerated per detail of like, this is your right and this is your right and this is your right. Like all of the things that have been written down in laws to say these are your rights, like the Bill of Rights, you get all of those plus all of the other ones that haven't been mentioned because there's so many other ones, because why? We're free and independent people. And then when there's a conflict of interest, or there is some sort of misunderstanding, or there's something that happens that has never happened before and it's a set of precedents and we don't know how to deal with the situation and it seems to not be so great in terms of the outcome consequences, we deal with it in that moment and we determine, well, is this a right, and where's the responsibility, and if this is a bad thing, how can it be corrected, and how can we set things right, how can we make sure everybody's made whole again, and how can we create new laws going forward with this new insights and new information, new understanding that we have. And that's how we perform the process of a perfecting of our union. And it doesn't seem hard to accomplish that. I really believe we can probably take the existing framework of the ERA and rework it to bring about this concept of establishing a civics branch of government, establishing personal dominion, and then making sure that in that we're really saying, in order for us to have the equal rights of all, we have to determine that everybody has the right to sovereign, autonomous personal dominion, and that we, the people, in our collective independence, in our interdependence, have to have a role in the government to make sure we have a check and balance that is necessary to make sure that the government does its job, and it's held accountable. And we serve as an anti-corruption mechanism. So when things that are happening, like what's happening right now with the POTUS 47 regime, getting away with a lot of, law breaking and, blatant corruption and, profiting off of the presidency and insider trading and, insubordination and, breaking laws and, potentially committing murder and, not following through on commitments and all these things. The people themselves will have an actual mechanism within the government to correct for all that and set us on the right trajectory. Because as we see now, the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate, the House, and they have the White House. And with all that amassed power, they're just allowing the executive to absorb more power than it really has. And they're relinquishing their powers, not doing their jobs. And so we need to be able to have a way to rein that all in and say, no, designated powers per the Constitution, and do your job, because that separation of power is what keeps everything balanced, to make sure that things don't, create, fatalistic synergies and things start falling apart. On the final note, I'll say, something I've been thinking about a lot today is the idea of, the Republican Party is the one that's like in charge now, right? They're the ones that have the power in the Senate and then the House and then in the White House. And what have they chosen to do with, this essentially, unilateral sort of like very partisan, capacity to direct the government however they see fit? And with that power, they have chosen to not create policy. The House was on hiatus for an extended period of time, which seems to be it was a cover up to help to protect a bunch of, predators that preyed on innocent women and young children, just to avoid having to do their job to help bring about, a bill that would release the information for us to get to the bottom of that terrible situation, to make sure, set things right, make people whole, help people begin the healing process, make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen again, these sorts of things, protect innocence. Instead of doing that and doing their job, which is, to help protect the American people, they took an extended vacation, paid. They're not creating policies to help to improve the lives of individuals. They have been passing policies to self-profit, to pay themselves millions of dollars from the taxpayers, to pay themselves because of the inconvenience of being investigated for wrongdoings by the government. They've created laws intentionally in order to pay themselves. Profiteering, which I'm pretty sure isn't even allowed. Like, Congress isn't allowed to make laws that is about self-enrichment, but somehow they're getting away with it. And they created those laws. They're taking away the health care of Americans just because they don't like the health care plan because it has Obama's name on it, which is just its nickname. It's the Affordable Care Act, Who cares if people call it sometimes Obamacare, but because Republicans didn't create it, they don't like it and they need to get rid of it or whatever. But yet they have done nothing to make a better option because they don't care. They don't care about creating policies that's going to make sure that we care for the health and well-being of Americans. They don't want you to fare well. And instead of, accepting that they haven't come up with anything feasible or viable to replace it, and being willing to just extend the credits that are helping to make it at least somewhat affordable, so more people can stay on the affordable health care plan and continue to have health care and continue to live. The Republicans instead are choosing to do nothing about it, knowing that millions of people are going to be priced out of healthcare and many people will die as a result of it. And they're not focused on creating anything to replace that. They're not focused on creating any bills. And time is running out on the deadline before those subsidies go away and the price goes up. And then really bad things are going to start to happen as a consequence. They don't even have the decency to care enough about you and me and everybody else who depends on this system, not even, like, sometimes just indirectly, not even necessarily directly, but it impacts everybody. Everybody's welfare is dependent upon this. The healthcare and welfare of everybody is dependent on this. And instead of them just accepting that they don't have any better ideas right now and just extending the credits for another 3 years, and then that gives them time to work towards a viable alternative, they instead are abdicating their responsibilities and they are not doing service to their constituents. And they're setting up the American people for failure. And they are so self-absorbed in trying to protect themselves and to align with Trump to the point where they don't even think for themselves anymore. And I understand there is a threat of, Trump sicking, his maddened horde of, extremist people to go and threaten the lives of individuals who step out of line from his will. And it's a terrible place for people to be in, but there's strength in numbers, and the more people who stand up to Trump and to reject his power plays and his abuse of power and his authoritarian power grab, the more people that stand up against that and say, no, you don't have the authority, you don't have the power, the more power and strength people have to stand up with you, and then things will start to turn. Trump will lose his power. And all of those people who have been radicalized by Trump to the point where they will threaten the lives of politicians who don't align with Trump, who have been incited to violence by Trump and his rhetoric, to direct that towards anybody who goes against Trump's will. All of those people need to see the example of elected officials standing up and saying no. Put a law on the books that says we have strict, stern, and swift consequences for anybody who would threaten political violence. And to hold these people to account. Give yourself leverage to defend yourself against this radicalization. And then start to hold Trump account every single time his rhetoric instigates this sort of terrible, bad behavior and violence. It is not in the purview of his role or duty as president to incite violence in his base, to go after his political enemies or perceived enemies. There is no justification for it, and we need to start creating the language and the affirmative foundation of law, legislation that says we do not tolerate this. There is a fine line of distinction, and if you dare to cross it, there will be swift consequences for it. Snuff out this crazy wildfire of radicalization that Trump has been fanning the flames of since he stepped on the political scene. And it goes back to what I said before. I believe in the redemption of everybody. I believe everybody who's in the MAGA cult and the MAGA cohort have been deceived by Trump. They have been misled, and they have been radicalized. And it's going to take a lot of self-reflection and a lot of self-development and a lot of, forgiveness that's extended to themselves and from others, and the creation of safe space and opportunity for them to integrate back into society without the radicalization. We're going to have to really work hard to help them to understand they're making a terrible mistake, but making a mistake does not make them a mistake. And we don't want them to be the mistake of the world. We want them to be a part of our society, because again, we need everybody on board to be able to help us to be able to make America great, and nothing that has to do with violence or dehumanization or, exploitation of power or the rigging of systems that create deepening inequalities in society. None of those things are great, And Congress needs to start taking extreme ownership of the situation where there are many people in Congress who are exploiting their power dynamics and doing insider trading, and that needs to stop. Create legislation on the books to prevent that from happening. Have corrective mechanisms. This is where the civics branch could come in. Have a corrective mechanisms to be able to call out individual representatives who are not adhering to the law, and for them to be held to account, and to have a legitimate process by which they can be removed from office that includes, the American people being able to call them out and say, we want you to, be held accountable, and to make sure that you're responsible. And if you're not going to, then you don't deserve to be in the position that you're in. You know what I'm saying? And in the deepening inequalities that are happening in America, it's really sad to hear POTUS 47, President Pandemonium himself, try to suggest that the economy is doing great, we don't have an affordability crisis, prices of everything is going down, and, everything's fine, because it's not the case. They're creating no policies to help to improve the housing crisis that we're in. They're doing nothing to help to improve the situation, to create resiliency within our agriculture system, and our farmers are suffering. And many of them are going bankrupt, and they're losing out, and then large corporations are coming in with their massive resources and buying up this stuff on the cheap. And the corporatization of our agriculture system is a instability. It is a fatal synergy, and it will lead to our demise. We need to not have this monopolization of our agriculture systems. And the fact that the cost of everything keeps going up, and then once the price of something goes up, it never goes back down. And with the cost of the tariffs creating the cost of goods going up, even if those companies didn't pass along, the cost on to their consumers, that company is taking a hit for the increased, operation expenses. And it's making it harder for those companies to be able to operate, which means that there is going to be some trade-off down the line, whether the company, has to fold, or they eventually pass it along to the consumer in the form of, reduction in production or in the increase in price, which either way is going to cause an increase in price. But once those prices go up, they don't go down. And wages have not been in any meaningful way approached to match, the increase in the cost of living. And people are priced out of, it's not even feasible for people to become homeowners anymore. People are living, in roommate situations, and there's so much houselessness in America, and those people are being criminalized for something that is beyond their control, and there's not enough economic opportunity. There are not enough jobs to that are good paying, good and decent work. And so people are not able to be self-reliant and self-sufficient and self-sustaining. And there is a loss of dignity in that, which is going to be a huge issue that we're going to have to face in terms of artificial intelligence shifting, our work dynamics. And POTUS 47 regime is doing nothing to help to shift us into a new economic alignment. They're just letting it all go to crap. Excuse my language. And so many people are going to fall through cracks, and they're going to fail, and they're going to suffer. And all of the safety nets that we did have been removed. And the ones that are still remaining are going to be overburdened, and there's not enough, tax revenues coming in because, all the rich people have gotten tax breaks, and there's the substance of the middle class is being shrunk and, eaten up. And so there's less, middle class paying in for the taxes, and so there's going to be less revenues coming in, which means there's less to be able to go around. And so what's going to get cut? Of course, it's going to be the welfare resources, but more people need them. And really think through the cycling effect of this reinforcing of negative outcome consequences that are just creating the perfect storm of utter chaos and mayhem. And this is all completely avoidable. None of this stuff needs to happen. We can take appropriate measures now to help steward the welfaring of society. And we can create the appropriate policy initiatives and the appropriate projects, and we can invest in the right spaces, and we can create the appropriate tax plans in order to make sure that everything is going to functionally work. And this isn't about, make the rich pay their fair share and fighting that system. It's like, no, we need to be able to get everybody willingly investing in the intentional development of the progress of society and the development and advancement of civilization together, so that nobody gets left behind, nobody gets kept behind, everybody lives the good life. And you're not seeing that. POTUS 47 is arguing the finer points of whether or not gas is under $2 or on its way trending towards that, or whether egg prices have come down a little bit, or whether they're going to source meat from somewhere that's not from America, but we're going to bring the prices down on meat and all of these things. And it's like, none of these piecemeal solutions are ever going to make a substantive difference in the lives of individuals, and they're not even thinking of that. Nobody in his regime is thinking about how do we create a thriving, welcoming situation that everybody can thrive on. How do we establish the modes and the means and the methods and supports and the reinforcements and scaffolding, building up the opportunity for people to level up their lives and to, break the cycles of poverty, and to give people the means for self-reliance and self-sufficiency, help them to learn the skills that we need for the 21st century and beyond. Start adapting in, being malleable, adaptable, mobile, and efficient, sufficient, stabilize our situation, make sure we're working on a trajectory of sustainability, get everybody involved, participating and contributing, understanding that we have to create incentives, but you also have to have regulations and bounds to make sure things don't get out of control. And we need to break up the monopolizations that have literally destabilized our entire nation. The waste is growth mentality that it operates off of is never going to be sustainable, and it will lead to the demise of our nation. And if anybody that is right now making massive profits off of America, the America that you appreciate for the fact that you're able to become rich because of the abundance and richness of America, you are risking all of that by not caring for or caring about the people who are creating the interwoven, threading of this fabric that creates everything that makes it possible for you to do what you do. It does not take much to create a welcoming situation that everybody can thrive on, so everybody lives the good life. It doesn't take much. It takes work, it takes intentional effort. Yeah, and it's going to take time, effort, energy. Yes, it's going to take money, but not as much as you would think. And if we can create a robust system that incentivizes people to invest in the developments that we need, where we need them, how we need them, when we need them, and give them a compensation of incentive to say, like, if you help to invest to develop these sorts of things out, you will get this break on your taxes down the line that makes your company far more profitable. And you can anticipate that and count on that and work on it in the future. And then bring everybody into a situation of everybody has to positively contribute and participate to society, but in return, You get the return on investment of, you get a welcoming situation that you can thrive on. You have, good health and well-being, quality education, clean air and sanitation, clean water and sanitation. You get, robust cities. You get innovation and education, and you get more equality. You get gender equality. You get no poverty. Everybody gets fed. So you have zero hunger. You have potential in everybody. You have, peace and justice and strong institutions. You have, partnerships to accomplish all these things together. You have the capacity to take care of life on land and life underwater, address climate change because it's real. You have the capacity to do all these things, make sure our cities are thriving and are robust, and our work is good and it's decent, it pays well, and it's forward thinking into the future. Like, all of these things, like, there's so much to do, and we must do it together. And the more that people that have more power and more money and more influence and more resources are able to positively contribute to that and invest in it, you're opening up the opportunity for more potential profits down the line, because you're raising the status of these people's lives, so you have more of a pool of customer base to pull from. You know what I'm saying? And then you don't have to worry about the conditions that you constantly argue about, I don't like the slums in the cities, and I don't like the violence and the crime, and I don't like the drugs, and all of these things. Like, all of those things can be innovated out by investing in the right systems that help to raise the standard, where those sorts of things just aren't a thing anymore. You know what I'm saying? And it's viable, it's doable, with the right approach and the right way for the right reasons, and in welcoming everybody into the situation. And everybody has a part to play, everybody has a role, everybody has a responsibility, but nobody gets left behind and nobody gets excluded. And the whole point is to scaffold our lives so we can start living a way of life that's good for everybody. Like, why would you not want that? Why invest all this time, money, effort, and energy in trying to create, a surveillance state, or more punitive situations, investing in more war and more, prisons and all of these negative things, which is so expensive, so much more expensive than it is to just set things up so things work good for everyone, and then a lot less trouble and hassle, because then everybody's taken care of, and then you don't have to feel bad about anybody else not making it in life. You don't have to feel bad because you have more, you don't have to feel bad about wanting more and pursuing more. There's bounds and there's limits to everything. There's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. So we have to live in a sense of comfortable conservation with one another. But we can grow together in our capacity and make our lives more expansive in terms of, creating a standard, what I like to call the criterion echelon of society, a criterion standard at which everybody lives the good life. And anything beyond that is excel, achieve, strive for, please do, because, there's no limit to any of that when we're making sure that we have a robust standard. And for that to not be static or stagnant, that has to be growing and expansive too, because the more expansive that becomes, the greater the outer limits is able to grow as well. And I just really want to see more leaders that have that type of desire and want for the growth and the well-being of others, and to the growth and expansion of society. And I know it's really hard. I know it's really hard to imagine doing things so differently than we do now, but it's not really that different, It's just asserting our values, setting our intentions, setting our boundaries, and creating corrective mechanisms when things go astray, you know, creating the right leverage and the right pivot points, establishing, you know, schedule and determining, you know, objectives, working things out with plans. You know, it's like a big project we work on together. We have accomplished incredible things as a species, and a lot of it has been done just like, you know, a few people pulling it here and there, but imagine what we can accomplish together when we all work together towards a same similar cause. That's why I believe in welfare and stewardship as being what we should have as the American identity. Embed the stewardship archetype into the American identity and live out as that sense of like, that's who we are, that's what we're about, that's what we're doing. You know, that's who you are, that's who I am, and that we're all in this together. How we go about it is going to be different and varied because we all have our own talents and skills and abilities that we can bring to the table. But ultimately, it's all going to come back into the fold in terms of accomplishing the things that we know we must do in order to make the situation better. You know, to accomplish the preamble promise, to live up to, you know, our sense of this is what we're all about: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, going forth in freedom, going with us, extending that freedom to ourselves and to others and to as many people as possible, you know, and do it on a continuum of an imperishable world peace. You know, as long as we continue to work towards this, nothing can ever stop it. You know, it's an unstoppable force for good.